Good morning, everyone. How is everyone on this leap day? Any leaplings with us today? Leap birthdays, anniversaries? No? Okay. We're leaping into International Women's History Month and Women's Day, so we're very happy to have you here. My name is Ariella Blatter. I am the President and CEO of Women in International Security, also known as WIIS. I'm very happy to welcome you to today's discussion on Deploying Feminism, the role of gender in NATO and military operations, with its author, Dr. Stéfanie von Hlatky, and our commentator, Inga Samoškaitė. Yes? Wonderful. We're pleased to have you join us again on this LEAP Day. And I think this is a very relevant discussion on gender and NATO as we draw closer to the summit that we'll have in July, the anniversary that we'll have in Washington, D.C. Women in International Security is a non-governmental organization that promotes gender equality by advancing women leaders in the international peace and security arena. I'm glad to see so many around the table that are members of the organization. But if by chance you are not members of the organization, I would remind you that it's very easy to join, and there are some codes around the table where that's possible. And we would be more than happy to make that a possibility. And if you do so, you'll receive 30% off of Stephanie's wonderful book as an incentive. For 35 years, actually over 35 years now, our organization has provided professional growth opportunities for women, led research projects, initiatives, and we provide a nurturing mentorship community for powerful security advocates, experts, leaders, and mentors. Our network now spans 6 continents, over 50 countries, and has 15,000 supporters that are all looking to close the gender equality gap. The benefits, of course, are many, but none as much as having people like Stéfanie come to us to talk about her book. So let's do that. Today's discussion focuses on NATO's integration of women, peace, and security agenda to assess the alliance's effectiveness as an agent of progressive change. But as we know, the WPS agenda is guided by a robust set of internationally agreed upon norms regarding representation, participation, and decision-making processes, and ensuring participation in all areas of for women in peace and security. But militaries are gendered institutions with specific structures and organizational cultures that shape their members' behavior through construction and reproduction of norms. Stephanie's book on the role of gender in NATO argues that WPS gender equality norms have been militarized by seeing women's contributions to NATO solely as a military asset, put at the service of operational effectiveness. Stéfanie will explain why this norm distortion occurs. And I really like this idea of norm distortion as an international human rights and humanitarian peace and security lawyer. Norms is what I'm all about, and I can add to my arsenal now distortion of norms. And how this distortion presents a complex set of considerations requiring NATO leaders to implement the WPS agenda and make gender equality a true planning priority. So the tension that exists here and how we're going to work through it. And as there are so many great experts, gender advisors, and those who have gender and WPS within their mandate here at the table, I think this is going to be an exceptionally rich discussion. Let me introduce our moderator for today. We have Dr. Karen Johnston, who is the research director at WIIS and an adjunct professor at the School of Public Policy, the University of Maryland, College Park, and also American University. I can't say enough about Karen's expertise. She is an exceptional policy analyst, project manager with government, nonprofit, and academic experience in international security, foreign and security policy analysis, U.S.-European relations, and gender, peace, and conflict analysis. So Karen, I turn it over to your expert hands to lead this conversation with our esteemed colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariella, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to see you, and I think that we could not have chosen a better time to be talking about these issues, not just for International Women's Day coming up and International Women's Month, but also the upcoming NATO summit. And I think that I was joking that I had sent a lot of questions to Stéfanie, because I think very much all of the issues that I think are really present and need to be addressed are addressed in the book, and the findings will help us clarify, maybe challenge us to look what the future will be for gender and NATO. So I'm very, very pleased that we were able to have you here. So if you're interested in learning more about our speakers, we have the QR code for the more lengthy bios, and also information about WIIS. And I think that we are just going to move to our discussion, and the way we've organized it is that we would welcome Stéfanie first to talk about some of the findings of her books. We'll ask a few questions. Inga will contribute some of her insights as a Baltic expert and as working at NATO, and we will then open it up for questions and answers after that. So thank you very much, and I will take it and hand this over to you, Stéfanie.
Thanks, Karen, and thank you, Ariella, for the that kind introduction, and also for talking about WIIS, because for me that's where this journey really started. Back in 2007, I participated in the symposium that was organized for graduate students, and I was a PhD student at the time, and just really opened up my eyes, and meeting women from all over the world who were working on international security created a new sisterhood of peers for me. And the first thing I did when I returned to Canada after that symposium is that I started the Canadian chapter of WIIS in 2008, and that's still going strong, and it's still very much needed. I am really thrilled to have this opportunity to talk about the book, especially since I know all of you have a special interest in the topic, and as was already mentioned, it's a critical year for NATO's Women, Peace and Security agenda, because there's a policy update in the works. So we'll see a new policy for women, peace and security this spring or summer. And with Inga, I am on the Civil Society Advisory Panel for Women, Peace and Security at NATO. So we've had an opportunity to peek a little bit behind the curtain, which has been a real thrill, and for me it's coming full circle, having published the book and now being able to have these discussions with representatives from other nations, and of course Inga is one of them, and I've very much enjoyed hearing her take, because of course the agenda has different types of interpretations based on the regional context, and that diversity of views is very valuable. So I want to provide a quick overview of the book, not getting too deep into the weeds, but to give you a sense of what sparked my interest in the topic, highlight a few of the key points, and then we'll move into an interactive discussion with the excellent questions that were prepared by Karen. And I'll start by saying that when I first learned that NATO had adopted a policy for women, peace and security, it was in 2007, I was working on nuclear weapons policy and extended nuclear deterrence. And that's what I recount in the preface of the book. And I was a bit skeptical at NATO's ability to implement in a fulsome fashion its new Women, Peace and Security, because it's a male and militaristic organization, and even though Women, Peace and Security was being more and more visible in NATO's public diplomacy efforts, I wanted to find out more about the extent to which it would be truly implemented in all of NATO's processes and activities. At the same time, in the scholarly literature, there had already been really fantastic analysis, especially in feminist international relations, about the militarization of the women, peace, and security agenda at NATO, but also in other contexts like the UN or other regional organizations or through national action plans. And so that was really the point of departure for this research, is to take that that finding about the militarization of the women, peace, and security agenda, but to ask why that's the case. Why does this happen? And to do that, you need to really look at the organization, its processes, the resources it dedicates to its policy priorities. And for NATO, to me, this meant looking not only at the articulation of the policy, but how then it's implemented by the military at the strategic, operational, and tactical level. So it was an incredible journey where I got to travel in headquarters at different levels and across missions and operations. Now, at NATO, I'd like to focus on two things, because Women, Peace, and Security primarily focuses on the participation of women and the benefits of diversity first and foremost. That is interesting because for decades and decades, military organizations were arguing that the increased participation of women could undermine operational effectiveness, and then all of a sudden you had organizations like NATO and leaders talking about the fact that including more women would improve operational effectiveness. So you really see changing of the narrative, changing of the discourse. But NATO is a bit constrained in its ability to really increase the representation and participation of women in its operations, because it relies on member states to make these contributions. So NATO will take what the member states offer. And so there isn't necessarily a mechanism that can be leveraged to establish certain targets. For instance, like there might be at the United Nations where those targets have been set. And we can get back to those types of constraints a bit later on. Where I find there has been the most movement on the implementation of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda at NATO is on integrating a gender-based analysis as part of the policymaking process and the operational planning process leading to the execution of missions. And so in NATO parlance, that's integrating a gender perspective. And that occurs thanks to the expertise of dedicated personnel, both civilian and military, who provide that expertise within their teams. And on the military side, you have gender advisors providing that advice to commanders. So when I first did the research, I was heartened by the fact that institutionalization had occurred to a certain extent. So, you know, despite my early skepticism, this was not strictly a public diplomacy stunt, but there was significant institutionalization because some positions had been created. So at the outset, a special representative for women, peace, and security, and then an office to support her work, but also a gender structure, so gender advisors and gender focal points at the strategic, operational, and tactical levels. So dedicated positions are important, and those positions were created, and there was guidance documents to support their work. Resources were also given, so budget and a trust fund was created. Training was also made mandatory and on operations too. There are certain training packages that focus specifically on women, peace, and security. So all of this is very important for NATO as a learning and teaching machine and the process of institutionalization. So yes, institutionalization, but what I highlight in the book is that it's been on the military's own terms at the end of the day. And so what's great about the military on the one hand is that you have directives and they get implemented. So things have happened. But then when it's implemented through the prism of military culture, you'll have this big focus on operational effectiveness because it's a primary consideration, and that's baked into military culture. We can get into the examples and implications of that, but I think it's very important to recognize that what's at stake here, I think, is a lack of civilian oversight at the end of the day, and how women, peace, and security has been implemented, where the military has been left to its own device to interpret based on its established rules and practices what the implications of the policy and the strategic directives are for their work or for their discrete military tasks. So as I end the book in the conclusion, what I do is I really make an appeal for more precise civilian guidance on women, peace, and security to inform the work of militaries on women, peace, and security, and then more civilian oversight of these processes as we continue to update and improve the political and military guidance on women, peace, and security. So I'll stop there as a 10-minute overview. I hope it puts enough material on the table so that we can continue on with a productive discussion, and I hand over the mic to you, Gary.
So we've come up with various questions that point to very important findings and observations in the book, but I think I wanted to start first, as I always think is necessary. I mean, this is a very informed group of participants, but I always find myself, at least sort of in the security sector, milieu, just to basically always start with, why does gender matter? Right? So the first, and we can segue into the second question. So why is gender integration into military forces so important, and how is it important specifically for NATO, based on your findings? And then we can segue into what your observation that the NATO's focus on operational effectiveness has distorted the WPS norms. But how, what accounts for those norms distortions? I think that's a very important, part of the book. And can you give us some examples of that?
Thank you. So why? I have a hot mic. Is that okay? There's a bit of distortion. Okay.
It's all the normative mic distortion.
That's right.
It's all
so why gender matters at NATO? So I think that what's been great to see at NATO is definitely more diversity. When I look at the last decade and a half, even just walking the hallways of the headquarters at NATO, you can realize that things have changed. But again, I want to come back to the idea that NATO has adopted a diversity strategy, but it only can control its own hires. So I think that the focus has been really important on gender integration when it comes to the representation and participation of women within, let's say, the NATO headquarters and institutions. And you can really see a commitment behind the diversity and strategy and tracking of data that's important to measure progress. But now I think we need to pivot on gender integration to working with nations and member states to talk about representation in the armed forces. So why not look at the UN model when it comes to targets? And when it comes to operation, it's to scrutinize a little bit more the requirements of NATO operations and missions. And so when NATO turns to its member states to ask for contributions, typically based on capabilities and numbers of troops and certain assets that are required, I think that's where you also need a conversation about representation. And I want to point to certain examples in the book here. One is that when NATO talks about women, peace, and security and promotes the agenda as a policy priority with host countries where there's a NATO mission, so K4 comes to mind, and the NATO mission in Iraq also. So when it promotes women, peace, and security objectives, but then it shows up with an all-male team to those discussions, it creates a credibility gap. And so I really think that in the NATO context, that needs to be taken seriously for the legitimacy and credibility of the organization in its relationships with host states and partner nations. So I do hope that the next iteration of the policy will open the door to these types of discussions, because I'll say that when I asked those questions during my interview, that's probably one of the areas where there was the most resistance about talking about the representation of women and mechanisms by which the representation of women could be increased in mission settings. So I think that that is an area of fruitful discussion for this group. Then on the distortion of norms and what may account for that, I talked about the lack of civilian oversight, which I definitely think is a key mechanism, but I'll point to one other mechanism in the book that's really important, and that's the presence or absence of a NATO command structure. And here it was really interesting to compare, let's say, the activities in the Baltics and the deployment of the 4 original battle groups in the Baltics and Poland, and the NATO framework nation concept, where instead of having NATO clearly in the lead to provide the guidance, you rely on framework nations to do the operational design of battle groups and overseeing the training and exercises in the 4 Baltic states and Poland. And so there you don't have that NATO command structure providing a standardized set of guidelines and practices, and you see women, peace, and security quickly falling through the cracks. In the context of the NATO mission in Iraq and KFOR, I identify, of course, shortcoming and gaps when it comes to the implementation, but the fact that there is that guidance, the fact that there is that gender structure, gender advisors, and gender focal points at all levels does harmonize and standardize those practices, despite the multinational composition of a contingent or of civilian and military staff in different levels of headquarters. And the final thing that I'll say in terms of providing an example on the distortion of norms is that ultimately what I found, and that's pretty consistent across the different mission settings, is that engagement with women stakeholders and women's groups is really seen as a way to improve information and intelligence gathering, which then will help the mission, but not necessarily the security of the population. And at the end of the day, you know, we want to establish that connection between gender equality and sustainable peace. And if you don't stay focused on that equation, it leads to very narrow militarized outcomes, like doing the work of the gender analysis and seeking broader perspectives and views from members of civil society and women stakeholders, but in an ultimately self-serving way. So I'll turn it over to Inga or Carolyn.
Let's do one sort of final sort of question, and then we'll have Inga talk also about the civil society panel, her experiences there, and likes. But I was really taken with, you've pointed out the ongoing discussion between feminist scholars and the security community, the tension that's always existed there, strong anti-militarist arguments against NATO, growing militarization we see globally that has increased a lot of activism around that, and the need to provide security and protection, on the other hand, against aggressive and violent international actors. So I suspect you would say that this is not an either-or choice necessarily, but perhaps you can give us your thoughts on whether or how, as you write, these feminist principles can make NATO better.
Thank you. And so this is where you get really comfortable as an academic, because we are okay with tension and we are not necessarily held accountable to resolve those tensions. So it's very nice to be able to write a book and to have that tension just be present from beginning to end without providing a definitive answer on how to overcome it. So I think the hardest part is is really when it comes to women's representation in the military. I think this is where the most heated discussions occur, because in terms of the gender-based analysis or integrating a gender perspective, I think there's a recognition that at least practicing those skills of thinking through the implications of conflict for women, men, boys, and girls to use the language of NATO's guidance, that can lead to tangible improvements in policy design and the delivery of programs. However, where it's a bit harder to resolve is to increase the representation of women in militarized organizations. And for that, I've tried to, safely remain agnostic in the book, because I'm not advocating necessarily for an increase of women in military institutions, but I'm pushing NATO to be held to account for the goals that it set out for itself. And so if NATO, as an alliance of democratic countries, has decided explicitly to increase the representation and participation of women in both its civilian and military activities, then let's talk about how to do that. And so it's funny because discussions on the book then very often lead to, okay, well, how do we increase the recruitment of women in the military? And I kind of push back a little bit on that, because this is not what the book is about, but it's about making sure that when organizations make commitments and embed those commitments in policy documents and military directives, that we as a community of scholars and practitioners kind of monitor those commitments and make sure that there's some accountability mechanism there.
And I would like to turn to Inga Samoškaitė. Welcome. You're only here about 4 weeks already, so we welcome you to Washington as well. But I would be very curious first, I think, to give us a little sense also of the NATO Civil Society Advisory Panel and what you've done there. And then also you have your own experiences and your expertise. You've worked on the Baltic countries in NATO on gender issues. And just as in reference to Stéphanie's book, are there many issues and problems highlighted in the book that are familiar to you and your own experiences in various countries? And where do you see also then, looking forward, those challenges and needs, understanding of WPS core norms to kind of really live them in NATO, and ensuring that NATO lives by its commitments?
Thank you. Good afternoon. So it's really nice to be here, and yes, it's my only week for actually at DC. So I just moved here from Lithuania, where actually we first time met Stéphanie, and I'm so happy to be here with you. And actually, I just told you before the start of our discussion that from all the books I own in Lithuania, I actually took only this book with myself to DC. So I had a feeling that we will meet here and we will be able to discuss it. So it's very symbolic part of my journey here. So the book itself is amazing, and I told Stéphanie many times that I'm coming from Lithuania, a very small country. In general, all Baltic states are small countries, and we're still trying to adapt and let new perspectives into our policies as well. So, and we lack of material in the Baltic states, so I definitely thought that everybody should read this book, and I promoted it at our MFA and MOD. So did my job on this as well. So a little bit maybe even about myself. So I don't have that much background from a military perspective. I'm more like working from civil society perspective with NATO missions. And myself as a teenager, I always wanted to go to the military. I wanted to join military academy, but again, I was told that it's not a place for women, and it kind of held me back for doing this. So I'm pretty happy and excited that I still have ability to work with missions in the Baltics and support young females who want to go to this journey, because I'm working on security issues, maybe not direct in the military as a troop, but definitely trying to contribute to this. So many aspects from the book is literally reflects Baltic states and our problems. And just end of November, we had a meeting where me and my former colleagues from the Eastern Europe Center, we organized a conference in Lithuania where we invited all 3 Baltic countries and all 3 NATO EFPs to discuss the problems and raise key issues. What do they face in the battle groups? So definitely, I think what Stéfanie already mentioned reflects the real problems. And even problems are like we come from the smallest ones to the biggest ones, because again, Baltic countries are small ones. I keep repeating myself saying this, but we are very young countries as well who just basically gain our independence. I can say recently, because it's a long journey. So I started to work on this topic 5-6 years ago, and not the funniest thing, but I think it is a problem, that I became only one civil society expert on the topic. So most of the time I talked about the problems with myself. Coming to the government, so again, coming from civil society, it lets me to speak probably more openly. So coming to a government, and they do not give it maybe that much attention to the problems, and we think that WPS, no, it's not a real issue. Why we should pay attention to that? We have many other problems. So I had huge challenge for years how to put this topic back on the table, and I'm so happy that now, actually after 5-6 years, I finally see some improvements and movements. So regarding my communication with NATO EFPs, especially last year, we started to have women's events at the NATO battle group. So basically, it used to be only me from civil society without my uniform coming to battle groups and meeting around 80 women who currently serves in Lithuania, Latvia, or Estonia. So again, this is different countries, different experiences, different problems, different good practices and bad practices. And the main of the issue which I faced is that, again, connection between NATO and the host nation. So NATO does have policy on WPS, but the main question which I raised as well at the NATO headquarters together on a civil society panel was how NATO works with allies to make it work, to make this topic important, because by the end of the day, these people who serve in our countries are the ones who tries to protect us, and we have to pay attention to every single problem. And I found that, at least again, comes from Lithuania perspective, I can tell about every single country, but that there's a huge missing gap about NATO, how NATO and host nations work together in order to implement successfully WPS topics. Because our national action plan is very not broad. Basically, it says that we have to do it, we have to work on it, but what about NATO EFPs? What about military missions? We have as well US soldiers in Lithuania, and there is nothing, you can't find anything in our national action plan saying that, yes, we do need to work on this, we do need to do something. We did, at the current national action plan, we only had oh, you need gender advisor. But in the years I tried to push this topic, and it was a huge struggle because there was huge problem to understand what is a gender advisor in general and why we need them and what is the problems. So basically the missing gap, like I'm coming to my point, is that when I went to meet EFPs, discuss the problems, I took one soldier from our MOD who was Lithuanian as well, and we finally heard the stories. So there is no communication on this topic at all. So we heard a lot of problems from uniforms, from even cultural brief, because WPS is not only about women involvement into military operations, but as well about human security in general. Oh, it's on. So if you don't do cultural briefs as well, can be about women, about kids, and what is the situation in the region. How do we expect that our battle groups will work efficiently when we will face problems we will see any crisis other crisis scenarios. I'm sorry. So again, so we know that many military missions we have in some of the regions only women can speak with women, like in the conflict areas, right? So this is really important. It's a critical issue how as well NATO should communicate with the host nation, how to make it work. So it's like huge missing relationship gap for me, and this is like really important part which is missing. Yeah, and on civil society group, so I'm very happy, and I was very surprised when I saw that I'm there with Stéfanie, because I still think that coming from my background, I still have loads of things to learn, and I'm happy to work with Stéfanie on this as well. So I think that NATO civil society is as well a good start which allows civil society to express the problems and to support NATO in seeing the problems and looking for solutions. I told many times in Lithuania that civil society do even more than government and do even more than all governmental institutions. And I made my point by inviting one of the meetings, all civil society and government institutions. So yeah, they were surprised. So NATO summit is as well critical in many aspects. We know we live in turbulent world now, and but I'm very keen actually to see what policy updates we will have during the summit and how this policy will be on the table as a priority. This is really important question which I as well now raising, because I think that there is a lot of lack of prioritizing this topic. So I don't know if I answered all your questions. Yeah.
Thank you. And we'll just open it up to questions and answers if you have, and Caroline, if you have another mic. Yes, please, over there. Thank you. And you can.
Do you want me to take the mic?
Yeah, you're gonna just identify yourself.
Hi, thank you. My name is Christine Woodstrom. I'm the WPS Program Manager and Gender Advisor for the Department of the Navy. And I was wondering, I thought a lot about what you speak about in your book. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I definitely will be buying it after this. But I was wondering if you could talk at all about if we aren't thinking about WPS as a way to improve our operationalization, then how does WPS fit into the mission set of militaries? And like a follow-up to that, is it possible to implement WPS as intended in the military without distorting WPS, or do we need to like limit how it's applied in the Department of Defense, and kind of leave the rest for USAID and state and that sort of thing?
Thank you. So I have had a lot of conversations with gender advisors and gender focal points, and I know that one message that comes across very often is that you have 30 seconds to sell it before losing someone's attention. And so I completely understand the pragmatism of the approach of connecting women, peace, and security with military and operational effectiveness, because I think in those contexts you have to be pragmatic. I think that where I see that there should be improvement is, that civilian guidance and that civilian oversight, so that we just broaden the lens a little bit when it comes to that single-minded focus on operational effectiveness. And I want to talk a little bit also about operational ineffectiveness, because looking at NATO operations of the past few decades, we can see several instances where securing long-term and sustainable outcomes in many contexts has not materialized, despite huge investments in resources, money, and of course, people and assets in those contexts. That investment has been enormous from Afghanistan to the present. So I think it's important to scrutinize the way that we do things, and the military has a big role to play in that. And then I think one of the big constraints is that when you only focus on women, peace, and security through the prism of operational effectiveness, it's very discreetly nested within individual military tasks. And what you want to connect that to is the longer term plan for achieving these sustainable security outcomes. So it's not completely removing the areas of women, peace, and security that can be helpful for improving military effectiveness, but it cannot be done at the expense of a longer term vision for securing those sustainable security outcomes. Because we have several robust indicators of what leads to long-lasting security. Gender equality is one of them. And so long as we don't recognize that, I think we'll continue to stumble when we design plans for specific political objectives, but only think along sort of 6-month rotations and what can be achieved then. So I guess I will say that I understand the pragmatism of the approach. I explain why it's there, but nesting it in a broader, longer term vision for the military is really important, and I think that's the next adaptation. There was an initial push for the policy and for military directives. Now let's look to how it can be improved, further specified, made more precise for military stakeholders on the ground who happen to be in the majority in those contexts and have a lot more resources too than some of their government counterparts that you mentioned.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Tony Rico. I'm a Women, Peace, and Security Advisor for the U.S. Army. And I guess my question is, when you talk about civilian oversight, I'm kind of thinking of the services like the Navy, the Army. One, who do you envision the civilian oversight would be? What would be their background? And then at what level for the individual services? Yeah.
So I'll bring it back to the NATO context, because that's really the context for the book, and it's whoever is accountable for developing the policy and the military directives in each respective institution. So at NATO, Women, Peace, and Security will have a big lead in drafting the policy, of course, in consultation with all of the member states of NATO through a formal committee process. And so when that initial policy comes out, it's looking at the specificity of the guidance. And one of the weaknesses from the last iteration of the policy, in my view, talk about that in the book, has been to say almost nothing about how women, peace, and security would be integrated into a renewed focus on deterrence and collective defense. So when you have, a very short paragraph, let's say, on that, and then, at the strategic military level, people are interpreting that civilian guidance, it's very hard. And I think that's that was one of the challenges raised by commanders on the ground, that they were trying to interpret plans from higher level headquarters, and sometimes it's just very vague and general. So I think that's the primary nexus is to find that specificity. So there is a role for the political side of the house, but also the civilian experts, in the case of NATO, nested within the human security unit. And of course, the policy itself, when it's drafted, has to be done in close consultation with the member states. But then once a policy is adopted, the human security unit can be empowered to provide additional guidance and implementation plans and all of those things. So that's where it needs to start. And that civil military exchange is really crucial, not just in a higher headquarter type of context, but also at the operational and tactical level. And very often at the tactical level, that civilian presence wasn't there. In Afghanistan, there was a greater civilian presence. When you look at K4, the civil military balance, of the headquarters is very military dominant, as expected. But you do need that civilian expertise also on the ground to provide that insight. And this is where the newer mission, NATO mission in Iraq, which got off the ground in 2018, probably is the closest to get it right in all of the missions that are covered in the book, because they included women, peace, and security and integrating a gender perspective as one of their lines of effort. And so as soon as you do that, you create a built-in mandate to be more precise about what that might look like in terms of outputs and outcomes. And you create a de facto accountability mechanism, because then you have a lot of people who have to report on the progress of that line of effort. So I think that is an important lesson learned for me. And what was also specific to NATO mission in Iraq is that they also had more civilian position within the mission structure. And sometimes recruiting those positions were harder, but they had, for instance, a security sector reform civilian representative, and they created a position for women, peace, and security as well. So you had that civil military interaction on women, peace, and security and gender right on the ground at the mission level, and that made a big difference. Thank you.
Just start.
First of all, thank you. Second, my name is Corey Flesser. I also work inside of the U.S. Department of Defense on the policy side of the house, and then I do some dabbling with the Atlantic Council on some of their gender and security work. This was lovely and so insightful, and I felt like you were writing my life, so thank you, or at least my professional life. You said early in your comments, like a lot, one of the odd dynamic that plays out is that NATO can only control the staff it hires and the things that it does at its headquarters and through its components. And sometimes it's sort of at the will of what allies and members give to NATO. And so I was wondering if in your conversations, people had any recommendations on what allies can give NATO that would maybe further add to the specificity around WPS implementation that you talk about. And the second question is, I think, sort of teasing out the civilian oversight piece, because I think the role of the Secretary General Special Representative for WPS has been this really excellent position and advocate for WPS in the institution. But then some critics will also say that by putting it separate, you sort of call attention to it, it's not integrated, Irena and then her predecessors, at least one of them has been like historically from the civil society organization that might not sort of navigate the political military bureaucracy as others would have hoped. And so I was wondering, if you could discuss maybe some of the pros and cons you heard for that civilian oversight role, also residing with this sort of interesting and different position, where else it could also reside, not necessarily eliminating that, but other areas where it sort of could embed itself to sort of have those type of specific effects on WPS that you describe. Thanks. I almost said over because I feel like I'm constantly on Zoom calls, excuse me.
Those are such great questions, Corey. Thank you. And I'm a huge admirer of your work as well. And so, no,
over here.
really amazing. I think that I think it's time to take a look at that fourth generation process and those fourth generation conferences and talk about the different operational contexts in which, it is necessary to have greater diversity on the ground. I can point to an example in the Kosovo Force K4 where I was interviewing members of the Carabinieri unit, and they do patrolling tasks. And I was asking, in their interactions in different communities, do they interact with women? And then he said, only when we have women on our team. And so, at the time in that particular rotation, there were none. In the previous rotation, there was one. And so you are completing the tasks incompletely based on the guidance because of the gender composition of the contingent. So I think it's really important to use these cases as part of the rationale that gender advisors were making and were including in their monthly reports of the chain of command for NATO, that for certain types of activities, women's representation is really important to achieve the goals that NATO set out in that particular context. And that what ends up happening too is that let's say sometimes they want to send out a mixed team for a civil military cooperation activity. What they'll do is, if they don't have women on their team, they'll pull randomly women left and right just to have that representation, which isn't fair or ideal either. So I think scrutinizing the force generation process and how we could talk about these specific mission settings and what might be required in terms of an adjustment is probably important for NATO. On the civilian oversight piece, I hear what you're saying, and I think those concerns grew when the Women, Peace and Security Office became a human security unit, because you've got sort of blended priorities between NATO's human security policy and then the Women, Peace and Security policy, and then there's some overlap, definitely, but it's created, I think, some institutional confusion. And I think some concern for external observers of NATO as to whether women, peace, and security will remain a priority. So I think in that context, it's not sufficient just to focus on human security unit, and it's important to look at the ASGs, the Assistant Secretary Generals, who oversee various portfolios, and I think there has been a good practice from the permanent representatives to ask for ASGs to speak to achievements on women, peace, and security front, and so I think that's a critical mechanism. And I think for all things at NATO, the missions and delegations have a big role to play, and I think right now those interactions happen very much through informal networks and initiatives. There was Friends of 1325 as well, but identifying which member states will be internal champions for the Women, Peace and Security agenda is very important. Now I would have said that, with Sweden joining NATO, that you would have had one more advocate, but of course the feminist foreign policy has been left behind in a formal way. But still, it's always looking at, okay, which NATO countries have feminist foreign policies or really firm women, peace, and security commitments, and leveraging that political voice within NATO. And there is still a critical mass. There's also lots of contestation, but there's still, a core group of states who are firmly committed to that at the national level, and that can be reflected in NATO level efforts. Thank you.
Yeah, just maybe a little bit. So what you mentioned, Stephanie, about operational level and about policy, and then military has to adapt it. So what is really like another one of the problems is that it always depends on the person who is in charge of, especially when you're coming off on EFP level, on the battle groups, who is leading. And I think they discuss it at NATO headquarters as well, that it is really important that policies are policies, and policies are made for governments, and it is really like bureaucracy, right? So it is important to translate the language to the military. Like it's all about why we have to have women in our operations. It's about effectiveness, that we can again reach the goals. So it's as well like just basically probably I can fill on that. But now we are happy to have, and of course, like the champions, the nations who are leading WPS is really, really important. And it comes from my experience working with, again, in the Baltics, just because we always have Canada experts, like we had Stéfanie coming in, we had Canadian soldiers coming into Lithuania to share experiences and examples, because we have to have good examples, we have to have good practices which we can work on, and the better cooperation between allies is as well very important. We actually had in November as well a meeting with Canadian government, so we are very happy that we are eager to work with us in Lithuania as well to adapt our national action plan to help us to seek the best way how we can grow as well. So the cooperation not only on the NATO level but between allies is very important, and I think that NATO can as well play quite a big role in promoting this aspect as well. So probably that's it.
Thank you. We're sort of nearing the end of our time. I just wish then to ask Stéfanie and Stéfanie and Inga about their final sort of thoughts, but also sort of again, because of this time with the NATO summit, looking a bit into the future and saying, you know, what are the prospects? Where are we? Where do we need to be? Where can we get there? Any final thoughts?
I think it's important with the NATO summit coming up and the celebration of the 75th anniversary to reflect on the values and principles that underpinned NATO's founding treaty, because I think that the current environment is we're focused a lot on very specific threats, but it's also a war on values. And I think that the rise of gender-based disinformation, the occurrence of conflict-related sexual violence, you know, in the war in Ukraine, you know, there are so many manifestations of this war on values, and there are fissures within NATO with some democratic backsliding and contestation around gender norms as well. So I really would like to see a clear focus on the values and principles of the Washington Treaty, and provided an updated take on those, and a very clearly and clearly stated and firm commitment in support of those values as well, which include gender equality.
Final thoughts. Definitely now, in the past couple of years, we see what is happening around us, and I think that for WPS topic, it was quite a huge shift, because it really brought back the topic on the table, and I do expect that this summit as well will even raise bigger questions on human security in general, on women, peace, and security. We see Ukraine, we see how Ukrainians included women on the battlefields. When it comes to a war and a conflict, it doesn't matter if it's a female and male, we have to find how to make it work. So it's again what Stéfanie said, it's now we are at the moment of, you know, battle of our values, and we have to keep going to work on that. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, but I think that NATO summit should be a good start, hoping for the best outcomes, and yeah, so it's...
Thank you, and thank you for joining us and for your wonderful questions. I've learned a great deal, and please join me in thanking our wonderful speakers and for their exceptional comments and for giving us a real insight into some very important issues. Thank you.